Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. Earlier this week, George Soros, global financier, told the BBC that if this upcoming G20 meetings don't come to an agreement for a multilateral plan to save the world economy, we're headed into a deep depression. Here's what he had to say.
I think that the G20 meeting is a break or make event, because unless you do something for the developing world, there's going to be a very serious collapse in that part of the world.
So you're not using the phrase depression?
No, I am using the phrase depression, because unless we take the right measures, we are liable to end up there. Unless we reconstruct and maintain the international financial system, if countries start doing it bilaterally instead of multilaterally, the system will fall apart and we will end up in a depression.
To discuss George Soros' remarks and the upcoming G20, we're joined by William Engdahl, coming from Frankfurt, Germany. He's an economist, an author, risk consultant for many financial institutions in Europe, which means he must be extremely busy right now because there seems to be a lot of risk for financial institutions in Europe. His upcoming book is The Power of Money, The Rise and Fall of the American Century. Thanks for joining us again, William.
Thank you, Paul.
So George Soros says we're headed to a depression if these meetings don't come to an agreement. And if he's right, then we're headed for a depression, because it doesn't look like there's much agreement amongst the industrialized nations.
Well, there certainly is not a basis for any serious agreement among the 20 nations of the G20. The problem is the G20 is an arbitrary construct that was hammered together largely by Washington in a vain attempt to keep the globalized system that they had created over the last 15 years, to keep the rules of the game intact. And the point I make in the book, The Power of Money book, is that the Bretton Woods, the dollar system, is what is broken, and that Humpty Dumpty has taken a fall, and you're not going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So the basis of consensus doesn't exist among the G20. China, Russia, they have entirely different interests right now than to bail out the dollar system and to bail out Goldman Sachs or Citibank and the various money banks that have caused this problem. And they're not about to do it.
So there seems to be two main areas of disagreement. One is Obama wants the European countries and China, all the major economies, to do a stimulus program somewhat at the same scale as the American. And there seems to be a lot of disagreement, not so much from the UK, but certainly from Europe. That's one area. The second is the whole issue of the dollar. So let's start with the stimulus side first and then move to the currency side. The president of the Czech Republic said that Obama's plan is the road to hell. Does this represent European opinion, and if so, why?
Well, it represents certain parts of European opinion. The Europeans are very skeptical about everything they've seen coming out of Washington in the last 18 months. They regard the problem, and they've warned against this repeatedly in government studies and publications of the European Central Bank. They've warned against the financial liberalization that Greenspan and Larry Summers back in 1999-2000 introduced, that allowed the banks to create this monstrosity. So they're much more conservative, and they see this as an American-caused problem, and they basically regard the call of Obama that Europe should stimulate more as an attempt to get the Europeans to throw good money after bad by bailing out the United States economy. And they're just not going to do that, and I can see why. It's not something that's going to save Europe and keep a stable. The other problem is that the European economy, unlike the U.S. economy over the last 20 years, has a relatively advanced infrastructure development, high-speed rail lines linking most European capitals that have been built over the last 15, 20 years. You have a highway network, you have the transportation grid of the European Union that now extends to Poland, to Hungary, to countries in Eastern Europe that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. And you have a huge internal market in Europe, so they're not as vulnerable to what happens.
Part of the European argument is that they have a social safety net, which includes a lot of unemployment insurance. So there's kind of a trigger there that automatically creates stimulus through more unemployment payment, and the United States doesn't have that. Is that a legitimate counter-argument to what Obama's saying?
Well, that's part of it, but the peculiar thing is that Germany and other major European economies have, other than Italy, as the big four economies, which has been absolutely oblivious in reacting to this, the Berlusconi government, but otherwise the German government has had a very active stimulus as percent of GDP. If you take it 2009, 2010, the total stimulus effect is virtually within 0.1% that of what the U.S. has announced so far. So it's not that they're doing nothing. They're stimulating purchases of automobiles, which for Germany's economy is a main pillar of support. And that has had a very, very good effect by giving bonuses to consumers to buy cars and trade in their old outdated automobiles.
So the Europeans think they've done enough in terms of the European economy. They think the problem's the American economy.
Well, basically, yeah. Not that they've done enough. They may have to do more, and they've said so openly, but they're going to do it carefully, and they're not just going to throw money in a panic in the manner they view much of what's happened in Washington as a panic reaction rather than a measured attempt to deal with the core problem. They can't understand why the Bush presidency and now why the Geithner-Obama presidency, Geithner as Treasury Secretary, why they don't put these 5 or 6 institutions, Citigroup, Bank of America, etc., into FDIC receivership, put them through Chapter 11, get rid of this old management that caused this problem, and re-regulate the banking system, these mega banks that have become too big to fail, and cut them down to size, parcel them out.
So is there lack of confidence in Geithner's banking plan is driving China, Russia, and some other countries to be talking about getting off the U.S. dollar as the global currency?
Most definitely. The proposal originated out of Russia, out of the Putin administration in Russia and Medvedev, and after a few days it was picked up by the People's National Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, and that is for using kind of a special drawing rights pool of currency instead of reliance on one single currency, the dollar. I personally don't think we're going to see anything like this emerge, the SDR proposal, but I think it's a very interesting signal that the major economies of Eurasia, European Asia, are beginning to think of alternatives to the dollar. One of the things that's allowed the United States over the last 30 years, since August of 1971, when Nixon broke with the gold exchange standard, has allowed the United States to run deficits without limits, has been the fact that the U.S. is the world's trade reserve currency, and other central banks hold these dollars. What do they do with them? They invest them in U.S. Treasury bonds, in bills, or in the bonds of semi-government institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That has allowed the U.S. to run deficits and finance such things as the war in Iraq, to be blunt, or the war in Afghanistan, through Chinese and other foreign investment in U.S. government bonds and debt. Now, so as the Chinese pointed out last week, Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister of China, pointed out in his meeting with President Obama, said, we have loaned a lot of money. This is very ironic if you think about it. We Chinese have loaned a lot of money to the United States, and we're concerned about the value of the loans that we have made. So they're worried about a dollar collapse. They're worried about a hyperinflation.
So if you take Soros's comment that this G20 is make or break, or we head into deep depression, first of all, do you think he's right? And what does Soros want out of these meetings?
What Soros wants out of this, he has to make clear. I certainly don't know, but I think he's not correct when he holds up this bogeyman of a global depression. I think it's a very differentiated situation in these 20 different countries of the G20. Sadly, I think the United States economy, because of the control of this money power in Wall Street over the congressional process, over the executive branch of government over the last 20 years, they have such a lock grip. It's some people have called it a quiet coup d'etat, that nothing is going to come out of the solutions of the Obama presidency, at least so far the evidence, that is going to really help the real economy and ordinary Americans find jobs and healthy income. So we have a skewed system that's become as corrupt as the most corrupt banana republic over the last 20 years of financial deregulation. That's what is not being addressed by President Obama so far.
So if the
When he
G20,
begins to address that,
if the G20 just ends with some rhetoric and no deal, is it as significant as Soros says?
no, I don't see so. I think the Europeans are going to struggle to find their own way. The big question in Western Europe, in the EU countries, European Union, is are they going to go down with the dollar system, because that system is going down at the rates that they're incurring indebtedness. We're going to have a 100% public debt ratio to the gross domestic product by the end of this year or sometime next year by best estimates. And the deficits are going to accumulate at the rate of at least $1 trillion deficit per year for the next 10 years. So this is a recipe for disaster. The baby boom generation is retiring. They've already begun, but beginning 2011, 2012, it's going to be explosive. And they're going to be pulling money out of the system that was creating the Clinton surpluses. The much touted Clinton surpluses were nothing but the baby boomer inflows of that generation into the Social Security system.
So the point is, if he doesn't take on what you're calling the Wall Street oligarchs, there's no real solution here. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for joining us, William.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington is a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said, in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.